This is the story of Easter Sunday, told in John's Gospel, chapter 20. Early on Sunday morning, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb and found that the stone had been rolled away from the entrance. She ran and found Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved. She said, "They've taken the Lord's body out of the tomb, and we don't know where they've put him." Peter and the other disciple started out for the tomb. They were both running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He stooped and looked in and saw the linen wrappings lying there, but he didn't go in. Then Simon Peter arrived and went inside. He also noticed the linen wrappings lying there, while the cloth that had covered Jesus' head was folded up and lying apart from the other wrappings. Then the disciple who had reached the tomb first also went in, and he saw and believed. For until then, they still hadn't understood the scriptures that said Jesus must rise from the dead. Then they went home. This is Easter Sunday. This is the day that the Christian church remembers and celebrates, that 3 days after Jesus of Nazareth was crucified by the political, economic, and religious authorities of his day, because his presence and his message threatened them, threatened to dethrone them from their place of power and control over society. So they did to him what lots of people in power do. They put him to death. 3 days later, he rose from the grave. Now, it would be enough for me to just show up on Easter Sunday and acknowledge and celebrate that happened. Just the fact that it happened. And let's be honest, you all follow somebody or something. You get up every day and someone or something that maybe you're unaware of, but it's directing your life. It's directing how you think, how you feel, what you value, how you spend your time, how you spend your money, what you do and don't care about, how you treat people. Someone or something is directing how you live. As far as I'm concerned, if somebody can predict that he's going to die and rise from the dead, and then that actually happens, I'm going to follow him. So it would be enough for me to just know that it happened. I would be here acknowledging it and celebrating it if that were it. But for 2,000 years, the Christian church has been gathering on Easter Sunday to celebrate Jesus Christ rising from the dead, not just because it happened, but because how we've come to believe why it happened. And let's be honest, probably a lot of you in the room, you're here, but you know, the thing that like we don't talk about is like, well, what does it matter really? I mean, yeah, we dressed up, we come in this Easter, and it's like it's special. But like, what does it matter? Why does it matter that a Jewish carpenter turned rabbi 2,000 years ago in a land far, far away was crucified by the political empire at the time, and then 3 days later rose from the dead? Why does that matter? What difference does it make in your life, in my life, or in the world? You know, because initially it didn't make any difference. Initially, Jesus' death and resurrection were essentially meaningless. I mean, John tells us that Mary Magdalene, one of Jesus' disciples, traveling companions, someone who loved Jesus very much, she shows up to the tomb on the first day of the new week. And she expects to find a sealed tomb. Because in her mind at the time, Jesus had died, and she was visiting a gravesite for the same reason I imagine most of us visit gravesites. This is where Jesus' body had been laid. This is, in a sense, where Jesus where Jesus was. She was there to pay her respects. She was there to remember him. She was there to mourn. Who knows? But when she shows up, it isn't like she shows up expecting his death to have meant anything. It doesn't initially mean anything to her. What she knows is that Jesus was crucified like countless other people before him, including 2 other people the same day. She shows up not expecting Jesus' death to mean anything. In fact, I imagine she interpreted Jesus' death the way I think I would have, as meaningless, as just another senseless act of violence, that it had no meaning. But the reason that she thought about it that way initially was because of how she made sense of the empty tomb. See, cross and tomb, Good Friday and Easter Sunday, they go hand in glove. One doesn't make sense without the other. If Easter Sunday hadn't happened, you literally would never have heard about Jesus of Nazareth. He'd have just been some Jew that got crucified by the Romans 2,000 years ago, like thousands of others. You don't know anything about them. But how she interpreted the tomb is essential. So we're all meaning-making creatures. We have no choice. We experience life, we take in data and information, and our brain, in this just amazing way, it just automatically, without our permission, it automatically starts making connections. Making connections in order to make meaning out of what we experience. The facts on the ground. Specifically, what we do is we tell ourselves stories. So in order to make meaning of what we experience in life, our brain creates stories. So it's not enough for us to just show up at the empty tomb and go, Jesus' body is gone. And then move on with our lives. We have to ask that question, why? What does this mean? What has happened here? We tell ourselves a story. And the story that made sense to Mary Magdalene, the story that she applies to the facts on the ground in order to make sense of this empty tomb, is that Jesus' body had been stolen. That was the narrative that made sense to her. That was the story that she created in her mind in order to make meaning out of the fact that his body was not there. And like Mary, the Christian church for 2,000 years has been creating stories to try to make sense of the fact that Jesus died and then 3 days later rose. And just like Mary's story that Jesus' body had been stolen, many of the stories that we create in order to make sense of Jesus' death and resurrection turn out to be false. They're either, at best, inadequate, they're just not enough, or they're at worst, they're inaccurate. See, it's not just any story that makes sense of Jesus' death and resurrection, the cross and the tomb. It's a very particular story. One that we don't get to create, it's one that we receive. So when she runs and tells Peter and John, and the body's gone and they stole it, and Peter and John come hustling to the tomb, the story says that when they finally both go inside, that they see and they believe. But then John says this, that it was in that moment that they understood from the scriptures that Jesus needed to rise from the dead. See, they didn't pluck a story out of thin air. They didn't concoct their own narrative. They had one. They had a story that they had received, a story that they had been a part of, and it was that story that made proper sense of what was going on. As soon as they walked into that empty tomb and they recognized that Jesus' body wasn't there, but the grave clothes were, it was like they just tapped into that story and they knew immediately what was going on here and what had just happened. So the question is, what is the story? If we want to understand why Jesus dies and rises, what is the story that this book tells? Again, it's not a story that we get to create. It's a story that's being told. A story that we receive. So what's the story? Well, this is how John's Easter story continues. says, when Mary turned to leave, she saw someone standing there. It was Jesus, but she didn't recognize him. "Dear woman, why are you crying?" she asked her. "Who are you looking for?" She thought he was the gardener. "Sir," she said, "if you've taken him away, tell me where you've put him, and I'll go and get him." "Mary," Jesus said. She turned to him and cried out, "Rabboni," which is Hebrew for teacher. "Don't cling to me," Jesus said, "for I haven't yet ascended to the Father, but go find my brothers and tell them I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene found the disciples and told them, "I have seen the Lord." Then she gave them his message. In my Christian journey, and this may be different for you, but in my Christian journey, the most popular story that we apply to the facts that Jesus died and rose is a story about personal forgiveness. That Jesus died and rose so that you could be forgiven and you could have a personal relationship with God that was otherwise unavailable to you. That's the story that I received. It's the story that I was raised on. It's really interesting when Mary finally realizes that she's looking at a risen Jesus. The thing that she does is she basically throws herself on him, clings to him. It's almost as if Mary's vision, kind of like many of ours, it can't get any bigger than it's just about me and Jesus. You know, Jesus is mine. And she clings to him as if that's all this is. It's just about me and my personal relationship with Jesus. Jesus responds to her by saying, "Don't cling to me." To use his specific words, he says, "I haven't yet ascended to the Father." See, Mary thinks, like a lot of us, and like I did for a long time, that the story is basically about her and God. And that's it. That's all the bigger it gets. You know, I was a sinner. I deserve to die. Jesus died in my place. Now I can be forgiven. And oh, happy day. Jesus seems to think that his death and resurrection are part of a much, much, much bigger story than just you and me. See, the story that the Bible tells, it involves your personal forgiveness. It involves your personal forgiveness. But it is not about your personal forgiveness. It's much, much bigger than that. The story the Bible tells is a story, the best way that I can describe it, it's a story of creation and recreation. It's a story of creation and recreation. You know, when Mary initially sees Jesus, she thinks he's the gardener. Well, Jesus was buried in a garden tomb. So, you know, there was good reason for her to believe that some guy in the garden early in the morning might be the gardener. Of course, it turned out to be a mistake, but it's an ironic mistake. Because Jesus is, in fact, turns out to be, in the story the Bible's telling, turns out to be something of a gardener. Cultivating new life in a new garden. See, the story the Bible tells begins with an act of creation. Most of you know that. The first words in the Bible are, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." God speaks and he creates everything that you and I know and experience in this physical universe, including ourselves. It's just an act of God's creation. Now, the author doesn't tell us why God creates life. The impression you get is that God creates life for the same reason we do. Tax deductions and free labor. Just kidding. The impression you get is that God creates life because God has life in himself. I mean, think about it. When you have love in yourself, love almost by definition has to be shared. It is a creative thing. It's what love does. Love always spreads, it always adds, it always multiplies. The simple impression you get from the opening chapter of the Bible is that God creates because God is life and God is love. And that's just what life and love do. They create, they share. Now, the pinnacle of God's creation, we're told, are human beings, you and me, for a very specific reason. Because we're made in God's image, is what the story says. See, what that means is that we have this unique capacity among all of the things that God has made. We have this unique capacity to imitate, to reflect the life-giving and love-sharing nature of God. It's why God put human beings in charge of stuff. Because in God's mind, he's thinking, well, if you guys will just behave like me, and give life and share love, like this place will be everything I intended for this place to be. How could it not? It's like when you read the first chapter of the Bible, it's like there's no other vision than God and what God has made living together, sharing life, sharing love. It's the same vision you had when you started expanding your family. You just want to share life and share love. That's it. That's the vision you get. That God's vision was, I am going to share life, share love, I'm going to create, and we're going to live together. We're going to share a certain kind of life together, and that's the way it's going to be. Now, within moments, or what feels like moments, author didn't tell you, but within what feels like moments, everything starts to unravel. And it unravels for a specific reason, and we miss this so often in the church. It doesn't unravel because human beings were disobedient first. It unravels because they were deceived first. They believed something that was not true, specifically something about God. That God creates because God is love. But see, the first humans were tempted to believe otherwise. The first humans were tempted to believe, no, God's not perfect love. God's not motivated by love. God doesn't really have our best interests in mind. God hasn't really created the kind of life that would be best for us. There's probably a life available to us that would be better than life with God. Because God's holding out on us. They were tempted to believe that lie, and they believed it. And let's be honest, most of us are still believing it. If not all the time, at least sometimes. At least sometimes. We're all in that place where we do not believe that God is love, that we do not believe that God is ultimately and perfectly trustworthy, that we do not believe that life is best lived in relationship with God and listening to God and following God. It might be just a moment here or there every day, or it might be the orientation of your entire life. But the same lie that they were tempted to believe, we are tempted to believe. And just as they believed it, we believe it. It is the source of the problem. It is like at the heart, it's the foundation of all that goes wrong. In the very next chapter in the story that the Bible tells, we go from life giving, God giving life, to the taking of life. The first murder in the Bible happens on page 2. You couldn't get a bigger contrast. You go from God doing nothing but creating life, and human beings in his image supposed to create and give life and share love, to the taking of human life. Cain murders his brother Abel. In the next scene, Cain travels east, and he establishes the first city. You wouldn't appreciate this, but it's the Bible's way of showing you. It's the author's way of saying human civilization human life, human society, was supposed to be like a garden cultivated by love, but it's now become more like a city founded by murder. That's where we go. And it gets worse. In the very next scene, there's a guy named Lamech. He participates in the way of Cain. He murders someone. But it changes. This time, when he commits a murder, he vows in response. He says, if anybody retaliates against me, they are going to suffer 70 times, 7 times vengeance. Infinite revenge. You see what's happening? We go from a vision of human life that's supposed to be characterized by life-giving and love-sharing, and now we're taking life, and it's escalating. Instead of giving life and sharing life, now we're repaying evil with evil, and it's escalating. By the time you get to chapter 6, we're talking 7 pages into the book, we're told that the entire world is full of violence. Do you see? You see what's happened? God created earth to be a kind of heaven. We turn it into a kind of hell. Every single day we do this. And we've been doing it since the beginning of time. When we believe things about God that are not true, it causes us to mistrust him, to go our own way, to try and cultivate human life on our own. That's the problem that we face. It's the problem we've always faced. It's the problem you see every single time you turn on the television and you watch a news program or you hear about something that happened in the community or some relationship in your life falls apart. It's the same story. It's human beings created in the image of God, called to reflect God's life-giving, love-sharing nature, but instead we don't believe that about God. We don't trust him. We don't follow him. We don't listen to him. We think we're smarter. We want to do life our own way. We think we can fix our own problems. We can pursue things apart from him. And what it leads to is not a way of love as characteristic of human society, but now human society becomes characterized by things like accusation and condemnation and even murder. Now, see, the good news of the Christian gospel is that God did not give up on us when we gave up on him. Just like I imagine if you have children, you would not be content to see your kids go the wrong way. God's not content to leave it alone. God commits God's self to fixing the problem. Not just to paper over it, but to actually solve it. To engage in an act of recreation, to remake the world. And the way he does that, at least this is the Christian conviction and confession, is he does that through Jesus. Specifically through Jesus' death and resurrection. That's how God remakes the world. See, if the problem is a lie that you believe as truth, then the solution would be truth that reveals the lie for what it is, right? If the problem is a lie that you believe is true, like God's not love, God doesn't care about me, where is God? God doesn't exist. God doesn't know what God's doing. If the problem is a lie that you believe as truth, then the only solution is truth that reveals the lie for what it is. And if you've ever read the story the Bible's telling, God, for a very long time, worked with a specific group of people and kept trying to tell them the truth. He kept trying to tell them the truth about himself. Hey, you got me wrong. I'm not who you think I am. I don't operate that way. That's not how I am. He kept trying to tell them the truth about themselves. Hey, here's what you're doing. Wake up. Stop going that way. Gosh, if you would just believe I am who I say I am, and if you'd listen to me and if you'd trust me, things would go well with you. But if you've ever tried if you've ever tried to tell someone that what they believe as true is actually a lie, how well does that work? It's like trying to convince somebody who's clinically insane that they're insane. The very nature of being clinically insane is that you don't know you're insane. And should anyone try to tell you that you are, you would deny it and just accuse them of being insane. And that's the story you get over and over and over and over again. God tries to tell them. And it's just not happening. Every once in a while, someone grasps it, but by and large, the crowd, they can't get it. See, when you believe something as truth that's a lie, telling you is not going to help. Something more substantial has to happen, something more foundational, something revelatory. Something revelatory. See, the Christian church believes that the death and resurrection of Jesus are revelation. It's not just God telling you something. It's showing us something. In a way that you see it. You're not just being told that you see it for what it is. The cross and the resurrection, they address the lies that are at the foundation of human society. The first is the way that we think about how we live, what the Bible calls sin. The people who executed Jesus, you may not know this, the people who executed Jesus were highly religious people. They weren't irreligious people. Both the religious authorities and the political leaders, religious in different ways, but they were very religious people. They had just very conveniently separated what it meant to be religious from how they engaged with other human beings. So for them, they had a particular life, and they liked their life the way they had it. Just like I imagine most of you like your life the way you have it. And then Jesus shows up. And gosh darn Jesus, talking about how things ought to be different. And you know, when you're at the top of the food chain and someone shows up and says, life as you know it is not working the way that I designed it to work. See, there's nowhere for you to go but down. Jesus becomes a threat to you, to how you live, to what you value, to what you believe to be true, to how you operate. And so they got rid of him, just like most of us do. But what's so important to understand is they thought they were doing the right thing. It's not like they knew. It's not like they knew they were in the wrong. They felt completely justified in accusing, condemning, and executing Jesus. They even came up with reasons to do it. Isn't that true of us? How about you think about it? The last time, even if it was in the privacy of your own mind and in your own heart, the last time you accused someone, maybe it was your spouse, maybe it was your kid, maybe it was a friend, maybe it was a coworker, someone who did something to you, somebody you saw on a news program. The last time you accused someone and condemned them in some way in your own mind, and maybe even executed them, maybe even wrote them off, weren't you totally justified? Weren't you completely justified when you did that? They were totally wrong and you're totally right. They're pure evil and you're pure goodness. They're off the rails and you've got your life together. You get it and they don't. Wasn't that how it went? It's because of how it had to go. You had to tell yourself those things. See, the people who executed Jesus, they were just doing what they thought they had to do. And for 3 days, they and we get to live in our ignorant bliss. We get to live in our sin believing that we can accuse and condemn and execute people and it's justified. It has to happen. It's collateral damage. It's the way that we protect ourselves. It's the way that we protect our own lives. And we can go on living that way as long as no revelation presses into our life that forces us to see it differently. But see, on the first day of the new week, the person they thought was guilty, the person they thought had been cursed by God, the person that they executed believing they were doing the right thing, he comes back from the dead. When you're party to murdering somebody, believing that you think you're doing the right thing, and the person you executed shows up 3 days later, that sort of forces you to rethink what you were party to. See, it's the cross when seen through the resurrection. That's why Easter Sunday is so important. Without Easter Sunday, the cross literally means nothing. But when Jesus rises from the dead, we see the cross in a whole new way now. Specifically what you see, what they had to see and what we ought to see, is that there is no separation between what you do to each other and what we do to God. They thought they were just killing some carpenter turned rabbi from Galilee. Turned out 3 days later, they crucified the Son of God. Every time that you accuse and condemn and execute another human being, no matter how justified you feel, the risk you run is that you are crucifying the very image of God in person. That there is no separation between what you do to people and what you do to God. Every time we accuse and condemn and execute a person believing that we're justified, we are actually participating in the crucifixion. The cross reveals what sin actually is and what sin actually does. It's not small. It's not innocent. It's not no big deal. It's the biggest of deals. See, now you see the lie that you've believed as truth. That's not all the cross reveals. The foundational lie is what we believe about God. That God's not actually good, not all the way down. Yeah, he can be good, God can love, God can forgive, God can be merciful, but he can also be very different from that. He can hold back, he can hold out. When Jesus is hanging from that Roman crucifix, having been abandoned by his loved ones, falsely accused by the political and religious authorities, mocked by drunken soldiers, he says, Father, forgive them. Because Jesus knows what I just told you. They don't know what they're doing. They are deceived. They've got me wrong. They've got themselves wrong. They've got other people wrong. They've got the world wrong. And this is what we do when we are slaves to lies. Lies about God, lies about ourselves, lies about other people, and lies about the world. Jesus prays, Father, forgive them. And then on the first day of the new week, when Jesus rises from the dead, what would you do if someone murdered you and 3 days later you came back from the grave? And most people would be payback time. See, when you read the story the Bible's telling, that's what you're supposed to expect. The guy that we just crucified is back. Shoot. Like that's what you're supposed to get. And the like eye-opening, miraculous revelation, the thing, we just overlook it because we're so used to coming to Easter. But the people that first experienced this, Jesus shows up and instead of proclaiming a word of war, he says, peace be with you. Those are the first words of a new world. It's a whole different way of operating in the world. That when we believe God is anything other than love, then we're going to imitate something other than love. And we're going to accuse, and we're going to condemn, and we're going to execute, and we're going to cause problems, and then we're going to try to fix those problems by accusing and condemning and executing, and it's just going to go around and around and around. And we don't see it until Easter Sunday. See, the light of Easter Sunday, it illumines the darkness of the cross. We see the cross for what it actually is, and our own sin for what it actually is. But we also get to see God for who God is. And see, what that enables us to do, if you are a healthy person, if you are a psychologically healthy person, and you see sin for what it actually is, the only reason that you engage in behavior that is anti-God is because you're deceived. And I am too. None of us has any full comprehension of what our sin actually does. We participate in things because we think it's no big deal, because we think it won't do any damage, or the damage will be sort of minimized, or it can be contained. It can't be contained. This is where it goes every time. And when you start to get eyes on that, if you are a psychologically healthy person, I can't imagine why you would ever want to participate in any of it ever again. Like the next time your brain starts to spiral and you start to go through that accusation, condemnation, execution, you would just stop yourself and you'd go, no, wait a minute, no. This is how it happens. Because when you see sin for what it is, why would you want to participate in darkness when you can participate in light? That's what seeing the cross through the resurrection enables you to do. You can renounce your participation in one way of being human. The biblical word for this is repent. You can acknowledge that you've been a part of it, and you can say, no, I don't want to be a part of that anymore. But you can also then pledge your allegiance to a new way of life. When you see God for who God is there any appropriate response other than trust? Other than reciprocal love? So you can renounce the way of Cain, the way of accusation and murder and conduct. You can renounce that way. In all of the ways that it manifests in your life every single day, big and small. And you can pledge your allegiance to a new way. The way of sacrificial love. The way of Jesus. What Jesus calls the narrow way. And that's how God recreates the world. That human beings now seeing sin for what it is and God for who he is can renounce their participation in the way of Cain, can pledge their allegiance to the way of Jesus, and can begin to remake the world the way the world was supposed to be. That's a much bigger story than just you're forgiven. You are forgiven. Make no mistake about it. There's not a person in this room or on this planet who has not been granted the mercy of God. Because God is love. God's posture towards you is love, and it always has been. Your forgiveness is supposed to be a means to an end. God forgiving you is an invitation to renounce one way of life and participate in another. See, when Peter and John left the tomb, the story says they went home. They went home. So simple. They just went home. And so must you. You have to go home. To your homes, to your families, to your friends, to your places of business, your communities, to your responsibilities. You have to go home. But they went home changed. That empty tomb meant that everything had changed. And everything would change, and therefore they had to change. And for them, that was good news. Because things in their life needed to change. And things in their world needed to change. So they went home changed. If you've entered the empty tomb this morning, you probably ought to go home a little changed. You probably ought to go home as someone who no longer wants to participate in a sort of anti-God, anti-creation way of living, but instead pledge your allegiance to the way of Jesus, the way of love. Participate not in what's been our past, the way of Cain, but enter into a new present and a new future, the way of Christ, a kingdom not marked by accusation and violence, but one marked by love and peace.